This week is all about how new species are formed by natural selection and isolation. It's called speciation. Have you ever gone to the grocery store and wondered why there are so many varieties of potato or onion or tomato? Why not just have one type? Each species is derived or created by the unique circumstances and unique environment in which it was formed. We have a great variety of species and high biodiversity on Earth because of this. Today, we're going to learn how new species are formed by natural selection and by forces that lead to the isolation of populations. You'll understand the second part as we continue on. As we go through this lecture, remember that anything written in black is something to write down in your notes, and anything written in blue is optional to write down. So let's begin with this question. What really makes a species a species? Organisms that look alike often belong to the same species, but this isn't always the case. It's hard to tell the African fish eagle and the bald eagle apart from the photos below, but they are, in fact, different species. On the flip side, organisms that belong to the same species can look very different from one another. For instance, dogs come in all shapes and sizes, from tiny chihuahuas to massive Great Danes, but they all belong to the same species, Canis familiaris, the domestic dog. So, how can we define a species? What aspects do we look at and say, this is a unique species and that one's a different one? Well, this has been a hot debate for a long time, but there are a few ideas that can be commonly used to define a species. There's the morphological species concept, which states that a species is defined to be a group of individuals who all share the same anatomy and morphological characteristics. It's easy to identify those who belong to the same species because they share common physical features. But what about those species that look almost identical and can trick you into thinking that they are the same species when they actually aren't? Some biologists use the morphological species concept to define a species, but not all biologists for this reason, because it's not always reliable. Then there's the phylogenetic species concept, which states a species is defined to be the smallest group of organisms that share a common ancestor with others, but exist on their own tip of a phylogenetic tree or a tree of life. Essentially, with this definition, a species is a group of individuals that cannot be narrowed down any further on that evolutionary tree. Placing organisms into species with this definition likely occurs by comparing DNA similarity and anatomical similarity together. Again, this one's used by some biologists, but not by all. The last concept is called the biological species concept. This states that a species is defined to be a group of individuals that are capable of successfully breeding with one another. This is the most commonly accepted species definition. However, it is often impossible to test or see unless you isolate those individuals in a controlled lab setting or in an enclosure of some kind and try to get them to mate with one another. So, for our definition of species in this class, we're going to stick with the biological species concept. So, a species is a group of populations that are able to interbreed or have babies with one another and produce healthy and fertile offspring, meaning that those who are part of the same species should be able to make babies with one another, and the babies that they make are both healthy, they don't have any fatal mutations that stop the embryo from developing or cause an early death, and they're fertile, meaning that they themselves can have babies when they're old enough. The parents also have to recognize members of their species to want to mate with them in the first place. How can we test this? Let's say we have two different frog species, but we weren't 100% sure that they are different species yet. In a lab, we can take a male from one frog species and a female from the other and try to get them to mate. If they never mate, then we can say that they don't recognize each other as being part of the same species. If they do attempt to mate and their offspring is never born because their DNA is just not compatible with one another, meaning that when their genes mix, it would cause fatal errors that would abort the baby, then at that point we would say they're different species. Also, if they attempt to mate and their offspring is healthy, but it's not fertile, we still say that they're not the same species because their offspring cannot continue the species in the future. Therefore, the parents must be part of two different species. Okay, so let's break this down some more. In order to have the urge to mate with one another, individuals in a population must be able to recognize each other. There are characteristics that we know are unique to a species, and those within that species should be able to identify those characteristics to understand the us versus them. A wolf can recognize members of its own species versus a coyote. They could recognize physical features, behaviors, sounds, smells, etc., and know that, okay, you're a wolf and you're a part of my group, and you're a coyote and I don't recognize you, so I'm not really going to mate with you. Here's another example. These two are different species. Don't they look alike though? They almost look identical, but these two will not breed with one another because they don't recognize each other as being part of the same species. These species use bird songs during their mating season to lure a female to mate. Each species of meadowlark has a unique song, and because of this, the females only recognize males who have a particular song that matches that of their species. So I'm going to play it, and I want you to see if you can pick out the differences between the two songs. So we can hear the difference, and so can the females. Now, you might ask, isn't life supposed to be diverse? Doesn't diversity in a species make some individuals unrecognizable? Well, yes and no. Diversity is extremely important to the survival of any species. It ensures that some individuals will survive selection pressures in their environment. But usually, diversity in a species is not drastic enough to not be able to recognize those who are members of your group. Organisms can recognize differences among those in their species, but there's still an instinctual understanding of us versus them, meaning that we instinctively know who is part of our species and who is not. Humans, for example, have great diversity, but we all recognize each other as humans. And agreeing with the biological species concept, we are one species because we all share common genes and can successfully breed with one another. We instinctively understand this. But it's not just being able to recognize us versus them to distinguish species. In order to be considered part of the same species, if they attempted to mate, individuals must be able to produce healthy offspring that can also have their own offspring in the future. If they can, then we consider them as being part of the same species because their offspring can survive, reproduce, and continue the species into the future. If they can't, that means they're different species. Now, there are exceptions to the biological species concept if we accept that as our definition of a species. What about extinct species? We can't see them mate. Instead, in this circumstance, we have to define species or a species using the morphological species concept to distinguish if fossils belong to an existing species or if they're considered their own. Asexual reproducers don't mate with others, so that's another exception. How do we use the biological species concept to define them? In this circumstance, we usually have to observe DNA similarity and similarity in appearance to define them, in which case we would follow the phylogenetic species concept. And the last exception are hybrids. Biologists have successfully created hybrids. Most hybrids produce infertile offspring. And so when a hybrid is created, it usually is not considered a new species. But recently, some hybrid babies have successfully produced their own offspring. This shows that the hybrid individuals potentially created a new species. But this still needs to be studied, but we may ultimately have to alter the biological species concept to include these exceptions. Anyways, no matter what concept is used to define a species, the process of creating a new species over time is called speciation. At what point is a new species created? Like this diagram shows, an ancestor gives rise to a new species. It tells us that populations from that ancestral species diverge, and at some point in their divergence, they become different enough to each other and to the ancestor species that they are considered a new, unique species. Their DNA and characteristics need to diverge enough to where, if we attempted to bring these two back together, they wouldn't recognize each other and their DNA wouldn't successfully mix together to create a healthy and fertile offspring. So, how exactly does this happen? Think of it like biological telephone. You know the telephone game? In this game, you start with a phrase. That phrase is passed on person to person. And as it is being passed, it might change just slightly. When it reaches the last person, that phrase is said out loud, and it's likely going to be totally different from the original phrase because it changed slightly again and again as it was passed. It might be completely unrecognizable. This is how new species are formed too. When individuals in the population reproduce, they pass on their traits to their offspring. Mutations might occur in the DNA found in eggs and sperm and will be passed on to the offspring. The DNA, in this case, has slightly changed from the previous generation. As time continues, more mutations can occur and characteristics can change. Ultimately, enough time will pass where so many changes have occurred that the individuals are no longer recognized by their original population, and they no longer mate with those from the original population. If they tried to mate and they were unsuccessful in producing healthy, fertile offspring, then we would consider those individuals to be part of a different or a new species. What factors lead to speciation then? Speciation can take millions of years to occur in the way we described, like biological telephone. However, there are some factors that can speed up the process. In order for speciation to really occur, DNA between individuals needs to be so different that the fusion of their egg and sperm does not produce a healthy and fertile offspring anymore. If they have regular access to each other, then they would have regular opportunities to mate and mix their DNA. The chance of their DNA becoming drastically different to each other would be low because of their constant contact. However, when individuals become isolated from each other, their DNA cannot mix, and so their genes begin to diverge or become very different to each other. When they're isolated, they will experience different environmental factors and different selection pressures that can influence their genes in different ways. This increases the chance of genetic isolation, the inability to exchange genetic information among individuals. If individuals are genetically isolated, that means their DNA is so different that a healthy and fertile baby cannot be made by the fusion of that DNA. So then, how do populations isolate from each other to eventually become genetically isolated? There are a bunch of ways. We're going to narrow down to just a few major categories. With geographic isolation, populations of organisms become physically separated from each other, blocking mating between the two populations. They can't physically reach each other to mate and mix their DNA. Not only that, each population will experience a slightly different environment with different selection pressures, which influence natural selection to occur in different ways for each separated population. Characteristics will change in different ways for each population because natural selection that plays upon their characteristics will be different. Eventually, they will become genetically isolated from each other over time. If they ever meet again in the future, they would likely not recognize each other to mate in the first place. And if they attempted, they would not produce healthy and fertile offspring. Each would then be considered a different species. Geographic isolation is the most common type of isolation that leads to genetic isolation. But it doesn't always occur to create a new species. Sometimes individuals can still be in the same region and diverge genetically. Let's start with behavioral isolation, and let's imagine that we have two populations of birds. in the same species that are relatively close to each other in the same region. One population, by chance, begins to change their bird song or mating ritual, which is now slightly different to the other population. This new bird song in that first population becomes common because the females find it appealing, sexy. If the two populations don't regularly interact with each other, even though they're in the same region, they can start to diverge because of this difference in mating behavior. If they eventually can't recognize each other because of differences in their mating behaviors, they won't mate anymore. They won't mix their DNA anymore. And so they will continue to diverge in characteristics and DNA and become genetically isolated over time. Something similar can occur with temporal isolation. Let's say we have two populations of owls that are part of the same species and live in the same region. The owls have predators, but one population's predator is nocturnal and the other diurnal, or awake during the day. This is a selective pressure. To avoid their predator, one population begins to sleep during the day and be more awake at night. As a result, the two owl populations are active at different times of the day. This means that the two owl populations are not going to interact much with each other, and therefore they won't mate or mix their DNA. They will ultimately become genetically isolated over time, even though they exist in the same space. This can also happen when populations change the time of year that they're active in, like when they hibernate or when they change their mating season. Last one, niche isolation. A niche is a role in the ecosystem that an organism plays. Each role is unique for a species to fill in an ecosystem. A niche can be defined by how individuals use resources, what specific resources they use and when, where they fit in a food web and who they interact with, what relationships they have with other organisms, etc. Combine all of those things and you define an organism's niche. Well, environmental factors and selection pressures can cause two populations' niche to change in different ways. Let's say we have lizards. These lizards, for the most part, exist on the ground, but all of a sudden a new competitor moves in and it also dwells on the ground. To avoid the competition, one population of lizards may begin to move up the trees and make their nests up there and look for food up there instead of being on the ground. Their niche is changing. A selection pressure influenced that. So the populations might diverge because one of the two niches is changing compared to the other. So they're no longer interacting with each other and therefore will not mate as often. All of these types of genetic isolation lead to reproductive isolation. When members of a population are prevented from reproducing or prevented from producing fertile offspring, they become reproductively isolated. Over time, because they can't mate and mix their genes, they become even more so genetically isolated. So let's summarize here. Take a look at this picture. In California, there's an ancestral salamander population that gets geographically isolated by a mountain range. One population moved west of the mountain, and the other one moved east. They are physically isolated from each other and will experience two different environments with different selection pressures that will cause natural selection to occur in different ways. This will begin genetically isolating the two populations. Over time, they'll start to become reproductively isolated from each other, mostly because they can't physically reach each other to mate. Let's say in the future they do find each other again, but because they have been genetically isolated for so long, they are now also reproductively isolated. They either won't recognize each other and won't attempt to mate in the first place, or if they tried, they wouldn't be successful. Once they are both genetically and reproductively isolated, they would be considered two different species. This is speciation. Speciation increases biodiversity on Earth. Speciation is the reason why we have lots of different species of very similar organisms. This is what I was asking about those potatoes and cucumbers and tomatoes, etc., at the grocery store. Speciation is macroevolution in the making. Each species has adapted to their environment. or to their niche in a unique way, increasing the diversity among living things and making the tree of life even fuller.